Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Fostering Creativity, Collaboration, and Inclusivity. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. This event will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. Our speaker today is Amit Mukherjee. Amit is a professor of leadership and strategy at the Hult International Business School. Earlier, he was on the faculties of IMD, Babson, and INSEAD. He is the author of Leading in the Digital World, How to Foster Creativity, Collaboration, and Inclusivity. Amit, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, members of the audience, for making the time to listen to me. Unlike traditional talks on collaboration and inclusivity, mine won't tell you that great leaders rely on these amazing ideas, and so should you. Instead, I'll argue that creativity, collaboration, and inclusivity have become existentially important. In the digital world, these ideas have moved from being nice to have to being essential for the organizations that you lead or aspire to lead. So I'll make that case, and after that, I'll discuss specific changes you need to consider and why in order to thrive. Okay, so this being a webinar, here's a question that you can only answer for yourself for now. Around the world, teams are the building blocks of all modern organizations. How long has that been true? Here's another question. Corporate leaders try to be coaches and guides, empower people, and listen to the lessons from the front lines. How long has that been true? Hold on to your answers. We'll return to them shortly. I'll begin the core of my talk by making a bold, sweeping assertion. Traditional attributes of leadership are biased and should be abandoned. And here's why. We are often told that leadership attributes are timeless. These words simply imply that what was valid 50 years ago, 150 years ago, or 1,000 years ago are still true. Worse, they imply that if you can't be like the leaders of old, you simply can't lead. If that's really true, most of us probably couldn't be leaders. We're also told, emulate this great man who behaved in this manner, acted thus, had these characteristics. And it's always a man, isn't it? In America today, Steve Jobs and increasingly Elon Musk are offered as exemplars. I've personally heard top leadership professors reinforce this crazy idea by telling their students that square jaws project leadership, and women should reduce the pitch of their voices. Does this bother you as it bothers me? Such ideas disrespect the diverse people who drive work globally, undermining the ability of many to even imagine themselves as leaders. Here's another canard. Our research, with tons of data, shows that these competencies are key for leadership. How old are these data sets? Does it make sense that while the world is changing as profoundly as it is, old competencies are still valid? Now, some of you probably fit these models perfectly. Even if you do, you should ignore them. Today's businesses are bringing together men and women from around the world. You'll inevitably work with people whose leadership potential won't be predicted by these ideas. If you believe these ideas, you will get blindsided. After all, while America has almost 300 unicorns, Asia alone has over 250. By the way, This isn't just a Western problem. In 2017, a renowned Japanese leadership scholar asked me to co-author a book on Asian leadership. I declined. Last year, an Indian leadership model was released. These efforts are equally flawed. They ignore the reality that while Asia has over 250 unicorns, the rest of the world has over 400. In the digital world, we need leadership models that apply across genders and cultures. More importantly, such efforts inevitably ignore the oversized role of technology. Now, this is where you need to recall the answers that you gave to the questions that I asked you. For most of the 20th century, ruthless authoritarians, not empowering inspirers, led American businesses. In the 1970s and 80s, Fortune magazine regularly published articles entitled America's Toughest Bosses. The last, from 1993, spoke of a penchant for psychological oppression, an especially sadistic way of making a point, bullying, cruelty, and abusive behavior. The 1989 article said, we uncovered no violence because several CEOs used to throw heavy things at subordinates who displeased them. You'd recognize the names of many of these CEOs. You'd recognize certainly the Fortune 500 and the S&P 500 companies that they led. These CEOs were called Prince of Darkness, Jack the Ripper, the Pompadour Bully, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a thoroughgoing SOB, mean-spirited, a ruthless, crude, arbitrary whipcracker. A research report grouped many into categories entitled Snake in the Grass, Attila the Hun, and Heel Grinder. Dr. Daniel Goleman is one of today's top experts on leadership. Go back in time to see how he described good bosses in 1986. Typically, they know the company's business and perform their assigned tasks, help employees grow, give credit where it is due, dole out criticism where it is needed, and create an atmosphere where it is easy to talk. Would you consider a boss which only did these things, but who didn't inspire people, who didn't think out of the box, good? No, because the standards of leadership have changed. And with that simple realization, you know that leadership attributes are not timeless. Authoritarian leaders were common in the 20th century because work and organizational structures required and enabled such behavior. Work was narrowly defined. If an engineer designed the left rear tail light of a car, presumably somebody else designed the right rear tail light. Assembly workers couldn't even talk to their neighbors to correct problems. Today, you are given the task of breaking down these silos that your predecessors deliberately created. But why did they do so? They created those silos because the technological environment that they worked in needed them. A set of technologies that we call scientific management measured people, holding them individually to demanding performance standards. People were not paid to think. They were supposed to do what they were told, often not more, and definitely not less. The bosses were supposed to do all the thinking, and the bosses were always right, even if they were wrong. By the way, if you set smart goals today, you are still following the logic of scientific management. Later, I'll argue that smart goals actually block creativity and collaboration. In the 1980s, the Japanese introduced teams and empowering leadership. My classmates at a brand name business school laughed, saying that these would never take hold in America's individualistic society. But then countless American companies went bankrupt. The big four car companies became the big three. Chrysler survived only because the US government rescued it. And that's when America began scrambling to change. Scholars began researching teams. The curve that you see records the number of papers they published about teams. After hovering around zero for most of the century, the curve skyrockets in 1990. Today, you get leadership training. Your own leaders ask you for your inputs, and you lead people in team building exercises. Thank the Japanese for pioneering these practices. Now, the Japanese didn't use teams in empowering leadership because their society was collectivist. They did so because they had adopted a newer set of transformational technologies, quality management. Long before anybody else did, they had learned that these technologies couldn't be used without teams and empowering leadership. Business schools then spread the message worldwide. A very simple message. If you don't change, you'll die. And so the attributes of leadership that many consider timeless actually started spreading a mere generation ago. By the way, customer centricity and agility are both based on the logic of the quality management era. So what have I told you? Transformative technologies change the nature of work. When work changes, organizational structures must change. In my book, I added, when work and structures change, the demands of leadership also change. Professor Ramchandran Jayakumar, who had identified the first two changes based on his study of all transformational technological changes that have occurred since 1780, used to say, doctrines of good management that work beautifully in one technological epoch tend to be insufficient in the next. He was a professor of technology and so didn't quite delve into leadership issues. In any case, companies that don't adapt to transformational technological changes can't compete and die. So another tech transformation, this time driven by digital technologies, is currently happening. A few years back, I started researching the changes it was producing. I found that I focused on a human activity that simply couldn't be done without digital technologies, the creation of genomic drugs. The images that you see are of a DNA strand, how genes were analyzed by hand in the 20th century, an old computer that a researcher used very early in the Human Genome Project at the turn of the 21st century, and how today, because of that project, genomic drugs and digital technologies are inseparable. I tested the lessons that I learned here in other industries, to make sure that the ideas were generalizable. I then surveyed 700 senior executives from around the world. Their distribution roughly matched the distribution of the 2,000 largest global companies. Finally, I interviewed mid-tier and CXOs in the US, Europe, and Asia. And yes, my sample included both men and women. So digital technologies are actually changing work in 5 ways. They de-skill the elite, enabling many people to do what only a few could. They upskill non-experts, giving them abilities they formerly lacked. You've probably experienced the impact of these 2 pathways. Sometimes they are linked, but they also happen independently. The other, less appreciated pathways are perhaps a bit more important. Third, digital technologies make work thought-driven, not muscle-powered. All prior transformative technologies magnified the power of human muscle. These uniquely magnify the power of our brains. Fourth, digital technologies deliver value from unpredictable sources. When cars began replacing horse buggies, predictably, smooth roads had to replace cobblestone roads. Also predictably, along highways, gas stations, petrol pumps had to replace stables. In contrast, app stores exist because Apple and Google simply cannot imagine all the possible uses a smartphone can be put to. I'll skip the 5th pathway, radical transparency, because it doesn't relate to this particular talk. In the realm of organizational structures, digital technologies distribute work over time and across geographies. The circle on the left, individual pharma companies used to develop traditional drugs. The circle on the right, in contrast, as I'm sure you have learned during this pandemic, many globally distributed companies collaborate to create genomic drugs. Similarly, more than 14 companies from multiple countries on 3 continents created the Boeing 787, providing technologies that Boeing simply didn't have. Finally, digital technologies tightly connect the insides of organizations to their outsides. In nanoseconds, small events can race across the world. In 2008, this fact, more than greedy bankers, corrupt politicians, or ineffectual regulators, turned America's subprime mortgage crisis into a global recession. An article on my website extends the logic of this argument to today's pandemic. So these profound changes in the nature of work and organizational structures are the ones that are making inclusivity, collaboration, and creativity existentially important for leadership. So let's consider inclusivity. When work is distributed, some people who are key for success don't work under policies and procedures you control or under legal systems you understand. They don't even look like you, eat like you, talk like you, have the same life experiences, or follow the dictates of your religion. When work is done inside people's heads, not outside their bodies, you simply cannot access ideas, concepts, and models that they don't willingly share with you. Yet, relatively homogeneous sets of corporate bigwigs still lead these diverse peoples. Corporate leaders still mostly come from the country in which the headquarters is located or from similar countries. In 2015, the New York Times reported that among S&P 500 companies, women CEOs were outnumbered by CEOs named John. In 2018, women still accounted for less than 5% of Western CEOs, and sadly, the number was probably lower elsewhere. When a homogeneous leadership group sets standards of behavior, those standards reflect their own cultures and lived experiences. Because these standards are not relevant to their diverse workforces, the leaders can slowly but inevitably lose control. Their people can walk away if they feel disrespected, taking with them the ideas in their heads. This is already happening. For example, Asian companies in Western firms talk to headhunters more often than their Western compatriots in the same firms. Countless articles online promise to teach you 5 ways to overcome such challenges. Most are useless. 2 years back, a software coder kicked off a crisis which is still afflicting Google. He wrote, "Women can't code." No list of 5 rules will ever make him an effective leader of teams that include women. Research offers a powerful lesson. If you believe in the benefits of diversity, you benefit from it. If you don't, you won't. So, truly embrace inclusivity. Don't try to change people's behaviors or force them to abandon their identities without really having good reasons for doing so. Mind your language of leadership. What do I mean by that? Americans, for example, expect leaders to be decisive. They overlook the fact that many people around the world come from cultures where decisiveness is not something to be admired. But that doesn't make them any less effective as leaders. Learn about people you work with, particularly if they are different or can't be or aren't co-located. Sorry about that. If not, in the digital world, you will lose the very people that you can't afford to lose. The digital world also demands collaboration because work is distributed, because we are tightly interconnected, because collaboration can produce unforeseen, unpredicted value. I interviewed a former CXO of a global company who was renowned for creating highly collaborative networks. A new counterpart at another company once told him, "Do you know what win-win means to me? It means you win the first time and you win the second time." Overuse and abuse of win-win has made it a meaningless, banal buzzword that inhibits collaboration. Use the term sparingly, because real collaboration recognizes that sometimes win-win isn't even the right choice. Megan Rapinoe is a brilliant American professional soccer player who is leading the fight for equal pay for women athletes. She's pursuing a win-lose outcome in her battle with the US Soccer Association. Hers is the right choice. Win-win wouldn't be. When you do use it, the term win-win, structure behavior and actions that demand and enable collaboration. Real collaboration requires all parties involved to do more for each other than they would for outsiders. Here's a simple test to decide whether you have the right mindset to collaborate. If you push your partners until they reluctantly say, "Well, I guess we can live with that," you don't. In an era when unpredictable sources often generate value, sooner or later you will lose. The partners you slight today in this way may hold back tomorrow insights that could benefit you. Real collaboration also requires a willingness to distribute power. The CXO I interviewed added that if you behave like kings of old, his words, pulling back decision-making power when it suits you, then you're really not collaborating. So check your behavior. What do you do? Now, because of cerebral work and unpredictable sources of value, the digital age's most important impact on leadership is the skyrocketing importance of creativity. Very few renowned 20th century CEOs had personally created anything that was new. Few famous 21st century CEOs have not created something new. CEOs in a 2008 IBM survey said their number one requirement of aspiring leaders was creativity. Moreover, the curve of the number of research articles that are being written today about creativity is rising exponentially, exactly like the curve that I showed you for teams. So if you haven't heard too much about creativity yet, pay closer attention. I'm not speaking about creativity of an individual genius like Michelangelo. Instead, digital technologies require groups and organizations to be creative. That makes collaboration essential. Oscar-winning producer-director Steven Spielberg said, "When I was a child, there was no collaboration. It was you with a camera." As an adult, he learned that filmmaking is all about appreciating the talents of the people you surround yourself with and knowing that you could never have made any of these films by yourself. Inclusivity is also essential. Serendipitously finding unpredictable sources of value requires associating with people with different knowledge bases and life experiences. And yet, our organizations are still structured for the 20th century. They single-mindedly pursue productivity, doing more with less. They actively kill creativity, which focuses on building things and imagining things that simply don't exist. So, if you are a senior executive who is worried about this, reassess your corporate policies. Perhaps, like many American companies in recent years, you've abandoned the performance evaluation systems that you implemented in the 20th century. But do you still mandate SMART goals? Do you still hire people only from a handful of schools on your approved list? Have you considered that your capital budgeting system by design is not going to fund creativity focused projects? If you are an aspiring leader trapped in that world, recognize that creativity by definition requires breaking rules. So start by breaking the ones that block creativity. Research shows that creative organizations encourage help-seeking and help-giving behavior. Most organizations, if you go and ask for help, you are showing weakness. That needs to change. And by the way, SMART goals, which were designed to enhance individuals' performances, don't allow help-giving and help-seeking behavior. So undermine SMART goals for your team members. You may not be able to change the entire organization, but you have no excuse for not changing the people who are looking up to you. Ethically and legally subvert the productivity-focused capital budgeting systems. My website has a link to an article that I wrote for Forbes a few years back that discusses how to take such steps. Organizations still structure work solely to improve productivity. They build pockets of deep expertise, long tails. In contrast, because of several of these pathways by which digital technologies work, today's leaders need broad wingspans, relatively shallow knowledge about many things. Now, let's be clear. I am not arguing against expertise. I want expert engineers to design the aircraft that I fly in. I want highly skilled doctors to look after my health. I abhor political leaders who claim to know more than experts. They are always incompetent. Always. I am saying leaders need a very different set of experiences and training. Without breadth, you can't connect those very different deep pockets of expertise. One top executive I interviewed called this the ability to navigate the in-between spaces that experts avoid. Another top executives added that in addition to possessing broad knowledge, leaders must be willing to read all the papers and learn quickly. Only then can they bridge differences and structure inclusive environments. Experts then trust them even when they are overruled because they know their views were heard and understood, not ignored. And so leaders with broad wingspans can help experts with disparate ideas collaborate to produce creative outcomes. If you are a senior executive, you probably already know that CXOs, research shows, have more in common with each other than they do with the people and the functions they lead. In other words, they have breadth, not depth. So consider what policies and procedures you need to change to build stronger pools of future leaders. If you're an aspiring leader, volunteer for badly defined, underfinanced, under-resourced projects. Ask people from other functions how they think about specific problems. These efforts will teach you to consider issues from perspectives you might otherwise not even consider. Finally, my survey showed that around the world, managers are making key decisions that cross organizational, national, and cultural boundaries much sooner than their predecessors did. Their offices don't house everybody doing distributed work. Moreover, de-skilling and upskilling gives them information that their predecessors typically lacked. And so, compared to even a decade ago, the power to make major decisions is actually moving deeper and deeper into organizations. This is especially true for multinational companies. Now, this very reality, of course, also reduces the time that people have to learn to collaborate well or to deal effectively with unfamiliar problems, unfamiliar people, strange systems. So if you're a senior executive, if you're an HR person, if you're a learning and development person, ask yourself, how do you prepare people for these challenges? Do you start doing so early enough? If you are an aspiring leader, I want to share with you an idea of what you could do to prepare yourself. A few years ago, I co-led a team that redesigned Hult's MBA program. We appointed as faculty people who had lived in multiple countries, spoke multiple languages, and could connect effortlessly with strangers from other cultures, even if they had absolutely no business backgrounds. These people skills are essential today. How will you acquire them? You may wonder whether this is academic mumbo jumbo. No, Well-known companies are already implementing such ideas. Johnson & Johnson spent 3 years developing culture and gender-neutral leadership standards. Daimler put into effect a program called Leadership 2020, which had the same goal. I keynoted the launch of that effort in Singapore. CEO and founder Mark Benioff regularly discusses Salesforce's efforts along these lines. In America in the 1980s, initially, a handful of companies experimented with teams and empowering leadership. And then suddenly, everyone was scrambling to implement them. In less than 5 years, the new ideas became the norm. Tens of thousands of managers and executives who couldn't adapt were fired. So much so that US national unemployment statistics actually rose. We are on the edge of broad scale change today. When it happens, it will happen very quickly. So let me leave you with one question. When these new demands of leadership take hold in your companies, will you be someone people will emulate, or someone who will be scrambling to catch up? That's the only thing that you need to consider. Thank you for your attention.
Amit, thank you so much. That was a really wonderful presentation. I'll give you a second to pull up your camera, and then we can dive into the Q&A. And a reminder for our audience, you can submit your questions by entering them at any time in the questions module. And the questions submitted are manifold already. So Amit, let's dive in. I'm going to kind of bounce all over the place. I had some questions that I had queued up in advance, but we have a huge surge of audience interest in picking your brain as well. So you wrote this book and did the research for this book prior to the pandemic.
Yep.
What has the last year taught you about leadership? What should we learn from it? And has remote work in particular proved to be a hurdle, an asset in adopting new and better leadership models?
So great question, of course, as usual. So what has it taught me about leadership? Earlier this past year, I was actually reflecting on this question. And what I was struck by is how remarkably similar are the paths by which a virus spreads across the world and how information spreads across the world in our interconnected world societies. And so a lot of the stuff that we actually learn from dealing with the interconnected world, information spreading, is really, really relevant to what we are doing with the pandemic. Actually, what we are not doing with the pandemic. So, for example, in 2008, 2010, after struggling with every possible option which could not work, finally, around the world, leaders of government realized you either tackle the entire problem or you're not going to succeed. You can't go and say, today we're going to rescue Bear Stearns. Tomorrow we're going to rescue Washington National. Doesn't work. You either deal with the entire problem or not at all. What are we doing today? We are focusing in most places on dealing with the individual problems instead of looking at the overall problems. Can it be done? Yes, it can be done. Remote work. One of the things that fascinates me is how many companies are poised to make a huge mistake. They have been looking at the last so many months, and you see articles and stuff like that about this. I'm sure you know this, saying, yeah, the last few months have taught us we really don't need to be at places together to work. Okay? So what they don't ask is, why do we need to be at a place to work? What do we do together that we simply cannot do when we are apart? And very often what we can't do is creativity. Very often what is really, really hard to do when you're remote is build trust. And we are not thinking about the long-term issues while we are focusing on the immediate problems that we can solve. Great, let's get through this. But then don't say that what worked in the short term is actually going to work in the long term. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think as we look into the future, every bit as cloudy as it always is, and we think about new hybrid work models, right? We new language, we're using this language, we don't know quite what it means, but it means some combination of co-located and remote work that looks a lot different from either the past year or the decades that preceded it.
Yep.
If we are moving to a model like that, how will we build trust in that environment? How are we going to overcome these significantly greater hurdles, presumably to collaboration?
Yeah. So, Paul, I'll give you a perfect example of that. When Hult moved from classrooms to online, I had my own method of building trust with students who walked into the classroom. Okay. And even I, who focuses on this problem, forgot that when I went online, I would have to come up with completely different ways of building trust. Okay. And it's easy to forget simple things like that when we are so focused on doing the work in front of us. How do you onboard a person? Well, let's make sure the person has a computer. Let's have this, let's have that, let's have that. But we don't spend enough time as leaders in actually fostering a person-to-person communication. And we make the problem worse over time. What do? Well, we have a team which is based all over the world, so we have to be very, very efficient with our time. Guess what? What goes away when you are being efficient with their time? People don't get to know each other. People don't get to talk to each other and understand each other. So imagine this, every time you look at a computer screen, what you're actually doing is you are trusting the person who sent you information, right? And if you don't break bread with the person, which you can't when you're remote, if you don't build these links, then you're only going to make your job harder. It's not going to hurt you with everyday things. It's going to hurt you when something really, really needs collaboration. So I'll just say one more thing, and I'll stop. I constantly tell executives and students that you can't lead in the 21st century unless you watch good near future science fiction. Okay, unless you read good near future science fiction. So let me make that plug. And here's why. Okay, think about all the science fiction movies that you have seen. Do you ever see movies, near future movies, in which people don't come together for work? You don't, because, and these are the people who are actually aggressively imagining things that are not a part of our current world. And even then, they can find reasons why people have to come together. So yes, we have to work on this hybrid model, and in particular, focus on how do we build trust at a distance.
Your description of the challenges to inclusivity, namely the diversity of the population with whom you will work, partner, do business in the digital world, could suggest that one of the most cited required qualities of the modern leader, empathy, may be harder to achieve than we realize. Actually, it sounds almost impossible to realize it. So I guess, one, I want to hear your kind of thoughts on that. And if this kind of traditional notion of empathy that we should be able to get inside how other people are feeling isn't really feasible if due to the kind of cultural chasm that exists between people. What does minimum viable inclusivity require? What does it look like?
Yeah, so when I was writing the book, I actually looked into the research on this question. And Paul, the most amazing research about this actually is being done in medical schools. Okay. Now, medical schools have found that in today's world, when so much of our medical training is technology focused, medical school students start losing empathy in the third year of their training, and they never get it back. They simply never get it back. And so in the US, at least, medical schools are now going and focusing on the issue of rebuilding empathy in their students, because a doctor without empathy is a doctor who is usually ineffective. That too, research shows. So they're going about doing this. And amazingly enough, so they do a whole bunch of different exercises. But what they're also doing, which is fascinating, is that they are bringing in technology in ways that people normally don't think about it. So think about a 20th century world, let's say, where we don't have this much of digital technologies. And one of the examples I read was for a 26-year-old woman who is studying medicine, and she is studying about a problem that a 70-year-old man who is losing eyesight and has a whole bunch of other problems is experiencing. And there is no way she can actually relate to that, except that with virtual reality, you can suddenly take this person and you can say, hey, look at the world through the eyes of a 70-year-old patient. So empathy, if anything, is more important. Again, it is something that we need to focus on. And amazingly enough, it is something that technology can actually help us with if we use technology creatively instead of simply focusing on how many people can we get rid of. Okay.
What does your research suggest about the way we identify future leaders, both within the organization and through hiring processes? Right? We as human beings, we get caught in these mental models of what leadership looks like. For a lot of us, that's still a very outdated model if we follow your line of thinking. So what are some thoughts to help organizations kind of break those models and identify leaders who might better, grow into the capabilities that you describe?
Okay. So that's a great question. I find that most of the problems that we have in companies actually are because of the performance evaluation systems that we put into place. Okay. What do? We create systems which screen out some people and screen in other people. Okay. So traditionally, what do? If you plan well and you execute brilliantly, that's how you get to positions of power in organizations. And that's the model that we use for everything. Now, when we are screening people and looking for whom do you want, that model which focuses on planning and execution What does it not do? It doesn't look at creativity. It doesn't look at help-seeking behavior, help-giving behavior. It doesn't look at something which is incredibly important in a world in which an idea can go across the world in a nanosecond. How do you sense and respond? Most of the things that you do as senior leaders is actually simply say, I don't have a plan. I'm going to figure out what I need to do, and I'm going to do it just like that. There is no planning, there is no execution, there is only sensing, responding, and learning for the next time. And none of these capabilities traditional performance evaluation systems pick up. So in the book, I tell the story of, I was taking a group of senior executives from a 100-year-old company in Asia to an incubator in their capital city. And this was serendipitous. We walked in and I had, 50, 60 of very, very senior executives. This company was chartered by the king, and so it was had a very, very long heritage. And a young man walked up to them and bowed and said, "Do you remember me, sir?" And he went to 4 people and he did that. And they all looked at him and said, "Oh, you, where had you gone? You were my best worker." Okay. So I asked this young man a question that I knew the answer to, but I wanted the executives to hear it. I asked him, if you were given everything that you wanted, would you go back and work for this company where obviously people love you? And he said, no, absolutely not. So I then went to him and I said, so tell me, why did you leave? So he hemmed and hawed, and then he said, well, I was managed for productivity. I was not led for creativity. Nobody cared what I could contribute as long as I did my job. So I sat there, I collected all the ideas, and now I'm building a company which will potentially put this big company in trouble. That's what we lose out when we stick to these old-fashioned models.
Amit, there are a series of really interesting kind of operational questions that I'd like to dive into, none of which is going to have an easy answer, I'm sure.
Okay.
How do you balance collaboration and accountability? Saying everyone as a team is accountable could be like saying no one is accountable. And let me just make this a compound question. In this environment, what are the options a leader has when when hard decisions need to be made? I'll put that in the passive, and the best pathway isn't clear.
Okay. I am just jotting down your 2 questions. I'm going to treat them separately, okay, if I may.
Yep.
So the story that I told everybody about how the Japanese came to empowering leadership and collaboration. The part that I left out, of course, many people might know, is the Japanese didn't develop those ideas on their own. The 2 people who actually developed those ideas were Americans. Edward Deming and Joseph Juran, and Japan's 2 national quality prizes are named after the 2 of them. Now, both Deming and Juran spent their lives trying to teach Americans that seeking individual accountability does not work. Now, that doesn't mean that if things go wrong, and we know enough examples of Japanese companies where things have gone wrong, nothing should happen. But the first bias shouldn't be towards pointing a finger at an individual. So Deming and Juran basically taught, hey, look at the underlying problem. Why are people making this mistake? I think when we start talking about accountability in this fashion, what we end up doing is we as leaders take our eye off the ball. We ignore the deeper issues that we need to deal with. So collaboration doesn't mean that you don't demand effectiveness. Collaboration means getting people together collectively so that they can be more effective. And how could you do that? So the classic example that I often use is this. And since you said it was a tactical question, let me give you a tactical answer. Marketing and sales never agree on anything. So let's take a product-focused company, simplest example, okay? Manufacturing wants to keep, supply chain wants to keep inventory low. Sales, manufacturing manufacturing, I meant manufacturing and sales. So supply chain manufacturing wants to keep inventory low, sales wants to keep it high so the product is always available. What do? We put them into their own boxes and hold them accountable for each of their goals. What is the best solution? Give an inventory related goal to the salesperson, give an availability related goal to the supply chain person, and say, figure it out. What have you done? You have diffused accountability, but you have created a better sort of accountability where people will have to work together. And those are the types of steps, very simple steps we don't take. Okay. So did I answer the question? I'm sure I missed the second one that you asked.
No, but you gave a great answer. So one more at least operational question. This is very operational. In most companies, performance bonuses are based on the financial benefits that the organization receives, right? You make your numbers, you get your bonus, but not on organizational behavior change. So what are your thoughts on this? How do we measure and reward the adoption of new behaviors?
Yeah, and I'm sure many of your the people online have heard about Daniel Pink and have seen the wonderful video that has taught at just about every business school that I've ever visited in, that you can find online on motivation, in which he summarizes a lot of very interesting research. And the essence of what he says is this, right? We don't pay people who volunteer to work on open source projects. They do it because they want mastery, they want autonomy, and I'm forgetting the third one. Okay, they do it because they want to do it. Okay, and the worst thing you can do when you're talking about building skills which are knowledge-based is to say, you are going to get this carrot only if you do this. That is the worst possible way of getting people to learn to acquire new skills and become better at what they do. And this is the problem, Paul. The idea of a carrot and a stick goes all the way back to the first decade of the 20th century. It is quintessentially scientific management, but it has been so drummed into our organizations that we can't seem to get away from it. And we have to. We have no choice but to get away from it.
Amit, we have just a minute left. So first, a number of people have asked for us to repeat the name of your book. It is Leading in the Digital World: How to Foster Creativity, Collaboration, and Inclusivity. And on that note, people have also asked whether or not you might suggest some other books that you think will be useful as we broaden our mindset around leadership.
Yeah. So I suggest, whenever I'm asked that question, and I'm asked that a lot, some crazy books which are not business books. I suggest a book called The Essence of Decision, which looks at how human beings actually make decisions. I suggest, because people constantly say win-win, go and read The Evolution of Cooperation, the first book which actually created the concept of win-win. They are thin books, and they are absolutely wonderful, and they will help you change how you look at complex problems.
Amit, final question. I want to do something positive and aligned to your work today.
Okay.
Give me one thing I can do to improve my leadership in my organization as a follow-on to this great talk.
If you have SMART goals, get rid of them. They are so incredibly damaging. So all the things that I could use to focus and attention on what can you do tomorrow morning, I pick SMART goals because of that, because they are so incredibly damaging. They damage creativity, they damage collaboration, and they damage inclusivity.
Advice heard. Amit, thank you very much. Thank you to members of our audience for your overwhelming set of questions, and I apologize we only got to a relatively small percentage. This concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you again, Amit Mukherjee, author of Leading in the Digital World, How to Foster Creativity, Collaboration, and Inclusivity. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.